heart and my soul, and most of my working life to date, have been in the Islamic world. I believe that if our planet is to have a sustainable future, we must engage all of humanity in the technological solutions, in business, in the private sector, in education, and so on. And that's why I've spent a lifetime building and investing in women and girls. So after university, I spent 3 years in the city, back in the late 80s, in equity analysis and then equity sales. I was one of 3 women in a dealing room floor of 500 men at Kleinwort Benson, which at the time was Britain's biggest investment bank. That's my boss, Piers. And through hands-on experience, I learned to recognize a good investment opportunity. It was fast-paced, bonfire of the vanities. I was a young, upwardly mobile professional, a yuppie as we were known in those days, being groomed for the top. So you may wonder how I went from wearing a sort of high shoulder-padded suit to wearing a chador on my head and clothes that somehow resemble more what I'm wearing today. Well, after the stock market crash in 1987, things got a lot tougher in the city, and I found myself fighting tooth and nail for something that I no longer believed in. This guy's boss, my boss's boss, came to me one day and said, "I'm going to take all your top clients." And I said, "Well, if you do that, I'm going to get fired." And he said, "Well, if I don't, I'm going to get fired. It's a dog-eat-dog world, each man for himself." So as I was having this stand-up argument, the dealing room floor fell silent, and everybody was listening, and I found myself with a little bird on my shoulder, which has never been there before, never been there since, and it was tweeting into my ear, "You need to use this fight for something that you believe in, something that can actually create value." So I took myself off to the Hindu Kush, as one does, and ended up setting up. That's me back in the early 90s. We ended up setting up around 200 schools on the Afghan-Pakistan border, and we also funded schools in India, Tibet, and so on, and Nepal. And the aim was to provide education to girls who were, in a way, beyond, they didn't have access to schools because they were in remote rural areas, and the nearest government school was a 6-hour walk away. So we put education into the home 20 years before digital literacy became an option. And my life's journey was inspired by this amazingly beautiful young woman who I'm sure many of you will recognize. Sharbat Gula, the green-eyed Afghan girl, was the cover of National Geographic, I think 3 times in the 80s and the 90s, photographed by Sharbat Gula, photographed by Steve McCurry. And that photograph somehow gripped a part of my soul, and I decided that I would do something to help Afghan and Muslim women and girls from the region. As a result of living in this remote rural area, I had to wear a shawl on my head to respect purdah, and so it became like a uniform for me. And in 1990, I was fortunate enough to discover the source of the finest silk cashmere pashminas, which were being produced in artisan workshops in Nepal. I was the first Westerner to walk through the door. So I brought them back to the UK initially, and they were launched on the shoulders of Christy Turlington, the biggest supermodel at the time in British Vogue, and they became the best-selling brand in Harrods for over a decade. There we go. So that's Christy Turlington launching my Pashmina brand in British Vogue. And because I also cared about empowering women and girls at the time, we used 10% of proceeds to fund the schools, the Afghan schools for refugees. So in a way, it was one of the first sustainable or ethical fashion brands. 2007, I was approached by Prince Charles's NGO, Turquoise Mountain, of course he's now King Charles, and pretty much ordered by royal decree to return to Afghanistan to set up a jewelry school. Being a dutiful Brit, off I went, and I arrived in the coldest winter on record in January 2008, wrapped in pashminas, I set up a jewelry school, and because I had had a background in fashion and branding, we were able to launch a jewelry brand as well. Now this lady here, bottom left, is the most incredible human being. She's a war widow in her early 60s now, and when she came to us, she was illiterate. Her husband had been killed by the Taliban. Her son has more recently been killed by the Taliban. And we took her to Jaipur for a 6-month skills enhancement training, and we taught her how to make beads and how to market them and so on. When she returned to her remote village in northern Afghanistan, she ended up employing more than 2,000 local people, including, well, actually, vast majority of them were men, but including 300 other war widows. And she produces these very, very fine lapis and turquoise beads, which go into a lot of fashion jewelry that you see around the world today. So that's an example of what you can do when you invest in and have faith in talented, ambitious women, even if they are pre-literate. So all of the research shows, the data shows, that female-founded and co-founded businesses, when backed by venture capital funds, are more sustainable, return more on capital, and exit faster than their male counterparts. In fact, last year was the 12th successive year in a row that venture-backed female-led businesses exited faster than their male counterparts. And some of these companies have reached billion-dollar valuations. So when all the evidence shows that women-led and diverse teams outperform, why do they get so little investment backing? Part of the problem is systemic. There are so few female VCs. With less than 12% of female decision makers at VC firms and only 2.4% of them as founding partners, female representation is low at the decision table. And yet female VCs are more than twice as likely to back other women. GEDI's aim is not to fund women simply because they're women. It's to change the institutional patterns that are preventing investment in great women-founded ideas, to identify the strongest, and then to build and accelerate and eventually to exit them. The problem is not one of pipeline. Over a third of entrepreneurs globally are women. There's a $3 trillion investment opportunity for those who can identify and build the strongest female-led startups. That's trillions left on the table by investors, and an incredible opportunity for all of us. So my life has come full circle, and I'm now back in finance, this time with an incredible team to capitalize on it. So here we are, energized, excited, and ready to get to work. We're sharing deals and investing directly already. I'm astonished by the caliber of female founders I'm meeting here in Dubai and throughout the region. I plan to move here full-time, as I'll be working with our team to identify and invest in the very best of them. To clarify, we won't be ready to invest through the fund until we're registered and regulated, but I do invite you all to get in touch with us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to invest in women.